Wait, did he just call the CEO the help? In front of hundreds of guests. What you're about to see isn't just another business deal gone wrong. It's a public insult, a $900 million fallout, and the downfall of a billionaire heir who thought power gave him a free pass. But he never expected the woman he mocked would spark a global reckoning. Stay to the end, because her silence? It wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of a storm that would shake the elite to their knees. This is one story you won't want to miss, because by the end, everything you thought about power, respect, and silence will be turned upside down. The late afternoon sun cast a golden sheen over Napa Valley's rolling vineyards as a sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate, one of the most storied properties in all of Northern California. The estate wasn't just old money, it was generational power, the kind passed down through silver spoons, Ivy League diplomas, and silent boardroom handshakes. From the back seat stepped a woman who looked like she didn't belong, at least, not according to those who thought they owned the world. But she didn't need to belong. She came to claim her place. Daria Monroe, age 36, adjusted the cuff of her midnight blue blazer as she stepped onto the marble steps of the mansion's grand entryway. She wasn't adorned in diamonds or dripping with legacy, but her posture, upright, precise, radiated authority earned, not inherited. CEO of Monroe Innovations, the fastest-growing tech firm on the West Coast. She was here to finalize a deal worth $900 million, a strategic partnership with the Whitmore Holdings empire, an old-world conglomerate with fingers in everything from oil and real estate to political lobbying. To the press, this merger was a historic leap. For Daria, it was the culmination of years clawing her way through doors not built for people like her. And now, here she was, walking into the lion's den wearing 4-inch heels and a calm expression that hid the fire in her chest. Inside the ballroom, champagne flutes clinked, laughter floated through candlelight, and a string quartet played something classical and forgettable. The Whitmores were hosting a pre-deal celebration, as if the ink had already dried. Until Daria walked in. Her presence sliced through the curated air like a needle through silk. Conversation stuttered. Next turned. A handful of guests leaned closer to their companions, whispering behind manicured fingers. One woman in pearls nudged her husband and offered a smile laced with confusion, or was it disapproval? Then, a voice rang out. Smooth, arrogant, designed to carry. Hey, called a man from the long white silk-covered dining table. Did someone bring the catering staff in a little early? A ripple of forced laughter followed, uneven and awkward. Daria stopped mid-step. Not because she was surprised, no, she'd heard worse before, but because she hadn't expected the first insult to come before she even made it to the handshake. The speaker? Chase Whitmore, only son of Ellis Whitmore, the family patriarch, and heir apparent to a dynasty built on old money and even older prejudice. Chase was in his early 40s, salt and pepper hair slicked back, champagne in one hand, smug grin in the other. Daria had met him once. Briefly. He'd been charming in a rehearsed sort of way, all teeth and insincere compliments. She'd pegged him for trouble then. Now she had confirmation. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to Ellis, the patriarch seated at the head of the table. He remained still, holding his drink, not even pretending to intervene. Daria's gaze swept across the room. Not a single person moved. Not one whispered protest. And just like that, the message was clear. You're not welcome here, not really. For a moment, her throat tightened. The kind of flashback no amount of money could shield her from. Being passed over for internships, being mistaken for the assistant, being asked, "Are you sure you're in the right room?" She took a breath. Deep. Silent. Recalibrating. Then, with a composed smile so poised it could cut glass, she made her way to the empty seat assigned to her, far enough from the Whitmore inner circle that the symbolism didn't need to be explained. Her dessert hadn't even arrived when she stood back up. "I apologize," she said quietly to the table, "but I'll be excusing myself." Her voice was steady, but her pulse hammered beneath her skin. Chase gave a smirk, unfazed. Guess she didn't like the menu. More laughter. This time sharper, less awkward. Now emboldened. But Daria didn't flinch. She simply turned and walked out. The room watched her heels strike the marble, each step measured, silent thunder. Outside, the air was cooler, cleaner. She stood by the reflecting pool, the estate glowing behind her like a monument to everything she was supposed to admire, but no longer did. Her phone buzzed. A text from Derek Young, her company's board chair. Press is picking up on the Whitmore partnership. Big buzz. You ready for the announcement tomorrow? Daria stared at the message. Was she? Less than an hour ago, she had every intention of signing. The deal would triple their valuation, open global distribution channels. And yet, inside that mansion, in front of all those legacy investors and board members, she'd been reduced to a stereotype. The help, the token, the outsider who somehow got in through a side door. And the worst part? No one had cared enough to stop it. This wasn't just a personal insult. This was systemic rot, disguised in black tie and served with caviar. She looked up at the estate's towering silhouette, her expression unreadable. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The evening wind whispered through the vines of Napa Valley as Daria Monroe stood at the edge of the estate gardens. The air was still fragrant with jasmine, but the insult she'd just endured was a poison in her throat. She had expected resistance. She had not expected public humiliation. Inside, champagne still flowed. But outside, Daria stared at the mansion with a look that was part steel, part heartbreak. She had weathered storms before, slept in her car as a broke college student, been told by investors they'd already funded a woman this quarter, even been mistaken for the assistant in board meetings where she owned controlling shares. But this was different. This was a mockery cloaked in black tie and candlelight. This was a declaration, not just from one man, but an entire system of silence. She turned away from the estate and began walking toward the valet circle. Her driver stepped out of the Lincoln Navigator, startled. "Ms. Monroe," he asked, "are we leaving?" She paused. Her mind was a war zone, business strategy clashing with personal dignity, PR fallout colliding with the bruises of a lifetime. She could leave and let the insult stand, or she could walk back in and show them exactly why she'd made it this far. She looked down at her heels, custom navy stilettos, and then back at the doors of the Whitmore mansion. No, she wasn't done. Not yet. With controlled precision, Daria turned on her heel and walked back up the marble steps. Inside, conversations buzzed again, though quieter now. Word of her exit had already made the rounds. Some speculated she was overreacting. Others whispered maybe the merger was in jeopardy. But when the grand doors opened again and she stepped in, alone, proud, unfazed, the entire ballroom hushed. Her stride was different now. Slower, measured, intentional. Chase Whitmore looked up from his table. The same smirk clung to his lips like rot. He leaned over to whisper something to the guest beside him, a brunette woman with smoky eyes and an expensive boredom. The woman didn't laugh. Daria crossed the floor like it was her stage. The gleaming marble didn't dare creak under her steps. Every eye followed her, not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it. This time, she didn't stop at her table. She made her way directly to the head of the long table where Ellis Whitmore, the patriarch, sat with a crystal decanter of cognac and a reputation that spanned 5 decades. He was gray-haired, with a commanding presence dulled only by the years. His expression was unreadable. She extended a hand. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you again for the invitation." He looked at her hand, then back at her face. For a moment, he hesitated, then shook it. His grip was light, not weak, but certainly not warm. "Ms. Monroe," he said with the sort of polished civility that sounded like condescension in a tuxedo. "Glad to see you've returned." "I never left," Daria replied coolly. "I simply needed a breath of fresh air." Chase, still seated beside his father, raised his glass again. His voice slid into the air like a knife. "Make sure she doesn't drink too much of it. Help's not allowed to rest for too long." This time, the laughter didn't come. The room had heard it before. The second strike. And now, the silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, complicit. Daria turned to face him, her posture unshaken. For a long moment, she said nothing. No one spoke, not even Ellis. The string quartet faltered slightly. A violinist missed a note. Then Daria smiled. Not cruelly, not nervously, but the kind of smile that lands quietly and devastates everything. She took a small step forward and locked eyes with Chase Whitmore. "You know," she said softly, "when people reveal who they are, some wear masks. You don't. You just walk around with the mask glued on and think no one sees the seams." The room inhaled collectively. Chase's smirk twitched. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she replied, her tone level. "I came here thinking we were building a partnership based on innovation and trust. But it turns out we're still negotiating with old-world royalty. Only now, instead of crowns, you wear designer cufflinks and call yourself the future." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some faces stiffened. Others turned away. "Ms. Monroe," Ellis said at last, voice tight, "I believe this evening was meant to be celebratory." She turned to him, still calm. "And I believe leadership is measured not when champagne is flowing, but when something indecent is said in your presence and you choose to stay silent." Ellis's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Have a good night," Daria finished, her voice quiet but thunderous. She didn't storm off. She didn't cry. She simply walked away, her exit twice as powerful as her arrival. As she passed the guests, many lowered their gazes. A few mouthed apologies. One young woman, barely out of college by the look of her, even reached out and brushed Daria's arm, a silent show of support. But no one said anything aloud, because that's what the powerful do when faced with courage. They watch and stay silent. Outside again, Daria finally exhaled. The night air touched her cheeks like a balm. Her driver opened the door. She got in without a word. As the navigator pulled away from the Whitmore estate, she turned her phone over in her palm. There would be fallout. Her PR team would be in chaos by morning. The board might panic. Investors might flinch. But none of that mattered. Not compared to what she knew now. She had crossed oceans of rejection to be here. And tonight she saw it clearly. The merger? The deal? It wasn't about growth. It was about validation. And she didn't need it. Inside the estate, the party dragged on. Chase poured another glass. His arrogance hadn't cracked yet, but a seed of doubt had taken root. Ellis sat silently, still gripping his glass, but drinking nothing. The moment had passed, but its weight remained. Because every person in that room understood the truth. They had just watched a woman walk away from a $900 million deal, with her head higher than any of theirs. The black Lincoln Navigator cut silently through the winding roads of Napa, leaving the Whitmore estate and its polished cruelty behind. Inside the vehicle, Daria Monroe sat in stillness, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between her and the darkness. The night should have been celebratory. She should have been sipping champagne, confirming press releases, watching her company's valuation skyrocket as headlines screamed, "Monroe Innovations secures $900 million deal with Whitmore Holdings." Instead, her inbox buzzed like a hornet's nest. "Daria, please call me back. Board is already in an uproar. Derek Young, board chair. We can't let this slip through. Damage control is possible. Let's meet first thing in the morning." Marcia Klein, chief legal officer. "Are you okay?" Sarah Kim, vice president and longtime friend. She stared at Sarah's message the longest. It was the only one that asked about her, not the deal. As the city lights of San Francisco finally came into view, Daria leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. Not now. What echoed louder than champagne flutes or backhanded laughter were the voices from a time long before she was a CEO. Her first day at Stanford. A hallway full of polished loafers and Patagonia vests. A whisper from a group of legacy admits, "I think she's here to help set up." Probably part of orientation staff. Her first job interview, where she was asked if she was sure she had the right resume. The investor who praised her pitch then offered to fund her if she let someone else be the public face of the company. Years of being too much, too assertive, too reserved, too quiet, too polished, too ambitious. She had built her empire from scraps, rejection letters, unpaid internships, silent discrimination, and now she was supposed to give all of that power away for a handshake with a family that couldn't even see her humanity. No. The navigator rolled into the underground garage of her downtown apartment complex. Her heels echoed against the concrete as she walked toward the private elevator. She reached her penthouse suite, dropped her clutch on the marble kitchen island, and poured herself a glass of still water. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from clarity. At 1:13 a.m., her phone rang. "Sarah." Daria answered immediately. Hey, Sarah replied. Her voice was cautious, gentle. "Are you okay?" "I'm tired," Daria said, "but I'm okay." There was a pause. "The board's worried," Sarah admitted. "Derek says there's talk of an emergency vote." Some members want to go to the press and salvage the deal before it collapses. Daria didn't respond right away. She looked out over the city skyline, lights blinking like scattered hope. I know this deal meant everything to the company's expansion plans, she said slowly. But if we move forward with them, after tonight, what does that say about us? Sarah hesitated. That we chose business over principle. Again, there it was. Again, this wasn't the first time, just the biggest. Daria had sat in meetings where clients mocked her behind her back. She'd heard men say, she's got the brains, but the company needs someone more presentable. She'd swallowed the disrespect before, smiled through it, because she thought that's what it took to survive. But tonight had crossed a line, and something inside her had changed. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. What are you thinking of doing? Daria didn't flinch. I'm thinking of walking away. Officially, the silence on the line was thunderous. You know what that'll do to the stock price, Sarah said gently. To our partnerships. To everything we've built. I do. And you're still going to do it. I am. Sarah exhaled. God, Daria. I wish more leaders thought like you. But they don't. You'll be standing alone on this. Then I'll stand alone, she said softly. But I won't stand ashamed. By sunrise, the pressure was volcanic. Her chief communications officer sent a draft apology to be issued on behalf of the company, just in case they needed to smooth things over. Her legal team urged her to say the comments from Chase Whitmore were misunderstood, misheard, miscontextualized. A dozen board members texted her to reconsider, but Daria didn't flinch. Instead, she scheduled a full board meeting for 7 a.m. She entered the glass conference room wearing a charcoal gray suit with pearl earrings. Her hair was pulled into a sleek bun. Her face, calm, composed, unapologetic. All 12 board members were present. The air was tight with unspoken panic. Peter Mallory, the CFO, spoke first. Let's cut to it. You're seriously walking away from the Whitmore deal? Yes, Daria replied. He laughed bitterly. That's $900 million in growth capital. Do you have any idea how this will look to shareholders? I do, she said. It'll look like we have a spine. Marcia Klein leaned forward. Daria, you're letting one man's rudeness ruin a historic partnership. It wasn't just one man, she said. It was an entire room that let it happen. We can fix this, Peter insisted. We can demand an apology. An apology means nothing, Daria cut in. Not when it's scripted. Not when it's forced. And not when it's meant to keep the money flowing. Another board member, Franklin Delgado, raised an eyebrow. Are we now running a feelings-based company? Or a business? Daria's voice turned razor-sharp. We're running a company based on respect. And if we compromise on that, then we've already sold our future. For what? A merger that makes us dependent on a family that sees me as disposable? No one responded. Not because they agreed, but because they couldn't refute it. Daria stood. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you. We will not proceed with the Whitmore partnership. I will personally take responsibility for the fallout. She walked out of the room, leaving behind a boardroom full of power, strategy, and silence. Later that day, the phones didn't stop ringing. Reporters flooded her office with requests. Investors called in disbelief. Twitter exploded. But Daria didn't hide. She prepared a press conference. When she stepped onto the stage, wearing a white suit and steady gaze, she looked like the future no one saw coming, but could no longer ignore. My dignity is not for sale at any price, she said. And if that costs us a deal, then so be it. Because no contract is worth compromising the integrity of who we are. Cameras flashed. Journalists scrambled. But Daria stood tall, unmoved. Backstage, Sarah stood watching with tears in her eyes. She knew this wasn't just a press statement. It was a war cry, a warning, a blueprint. That night, back at her apartment, Daria sat alone at her window. The city sparkled beneath her. She had done the unthinkable, walked away from power, chose principles over millions, stood alone, and didn't fall. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a single text from her mother. You've always known your worth. Now the world does too. Daria smiled for the first time in 2 days. Because she wasn't just walking away from a deal. She was walking into something far greater. At precisely 7 a.m., the elevator doors opened with a soft chime at Monroe Innovations' glass-walled headquarters in downtown San Francisco. The floor was unusually quiet. No early chatter. No casual greetings. Just the weight of anticipation hanging thick in the air. Daria Monroe stepped out, holding a single leather-bound folder in her left hand. Her stride was as precise as ever, her slate-gray pantsuit immaculate, her face calm, though beneath it, the storm of what she was about to do swirled violently. The boardroom was already full. 12 directors, senior executives, department heads, the legal team. Each person wore a different shade of tension, some cloaked it in indifference, others in nervous pacing, and a few in outright resentment. No one smiled. Daria stood at the head of the long, polished walnut table, not bothering to sit. She placed the folder in front of her and took a moment to scan every face in the room. These were people she had fought beside, grown with, and in some cases, pulled through fires. Yet today, many looked at her not as their CEO, but as the reason they were about to enter a storm they hadn't asked for. She inhaled. "I know you all understand what happened last night," she began, her voice composed but unwavering. "At the Whitmore estate, I was publicly humiliated by a man who represents the very institution we were preparing to merge with. Not a single person in that room stood up to challenge him. Not his father. Not his peers. No one. The room was silent. The only sound was the subtle hum of the building's ventilation system." Daria continued, "I understand the value of the Whitmore partnership. I know that $900 million means growth, leverage, and market access we haven't had before. But I also know what it would cost us." She paused. "It would cost us our values." Peter Mallory, the CFO, silver-haired, Harvard-educated, with a history of calling her decisions idealistic, was the first to speak. "Daria," he said, measured but firm, "I respect your position, but this isn't about values. It's about survival, about the future of this company." "Our future," she replied, "depends on who we are, not just what we can buy." "You don't get to make this call unilaterally," Peter shot back. "This affects every shareholder, every employee, the entire enterprise." "I'm not making this call emotionally," she said. "I'm making it because if we align ourselves with the Whitmore family now, we are telling the world, and every person who works for us, that their dignity is for sale." A murmur went around the table. Margaret Lynn, a long-standing board member with over 20 years of corporate experience, leaned forward. "Daria," she said carefully, "you've built something extraordinary. But maybe a formal apology from the Whitmores, one carefully structured, would suffice. We can't let a moment of arrogance sink this deal." "A moment of arrogance," Daria said softly, but the steel in her tone froze the air. "Margaret, it wasn't a moment. It was a culture. It was years of silent acceptance wrapped in tuxedos and champagne. It was watching someone strip me of my humanity while an entire room laughed." Margaret's lips pressed together. She said nothing. Peter leaned in again. "Our share price will drop. Investors will panic. We may lose partnerships. You think shareholders will support this decision?" "I'll tell them the truth," Daria said. "That we don't do business with cowards." That sentence hung in the air like a slap. Nobody interrupted. The silence wasn't polite, it was rattled. Across the table, young CTO Malcolm Reyes finally spoke. He was usually quiet, technical, rarely involved in the politics of the board. But now he looked directly at Daria. "Do you believe we'll recover from the fallout?" he asked. Daria nodded. "Yes, because people are watching. They're tired of companies preaching ethics and abandoning them for money. If we do this right, we won't just recover, we'll lead." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Then I support the decision." Peter stood. "You've always been the face of this company, Daria. But if this backfires, it won't be just your reputation that falls. It'll be all of ours." Daria walked around the table, standing tall at the far end. "I know what I'm risking. But I also know that this company was built not just to succeed, but to matter." She faced the entire board. "I am officially withdrawing us from the Whitmore partnership. Effective immediately." The room sat in stunned silence. No one clapped. No one objected. Because somewhere, in the marrow of their bones, they knew she was right. She gathered her folder and walked out. By mid-morning, news had begun to leak. A single source. One quote. "Monroe Innovations walks away from $900 million Whitmore deal. CEO cites ethical conflict." The media frenzy was instantaneous. CNBC requested a statement. Bloomberg wanted an exclusive. Twitter exploded with speculation. Stock tickers fluttered nervously. The company's valuation trembled. Inside her office, Daria watched the headlines roll in, her jaw firm. Sarah entered, holding a tablet. They're trying to spin it, Sarah said. The Whitmores just released a statement calling it a disappointing collapse due to miscommunication and misunderstandings. They're trying to protect the brand, Daria replied. They should be worried about protecting their conscience. She stood. Schedule a press conference. Sarah blinked. You sure? Daria nodded. Let's make it clear. We didn't stumble. We walked away. At 3 p.m., Daria Monroe stood at a podium in front of a wall of flashing cameras. She wore the same charcoal gray suit from earlier that morning. The room buzzed with tension. My name is Daria Monroe, she began. I am the CEO of Monroe Innovations. Last night, I was invited as a partner and treated as less than a person. Not one person in that room intervened. And today, I have made the decision to end all negotiations with Whitmore Holdings. Cameras flashed. Whispers rose. Many will call this reckless. Many will say, I let personal feelings cloud business judgment. But I didn't walk away from a deal. I walked away from a message that said it's okay to insult someone's worth and still shake their hand after. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. If that's the cost of doing business, I'm not buying. Silence. Then applause, from her staff, from the back of the room, from some members of the press who couldn't hide their admiration. Backstage, Sarah watched with quiet pride. And far away, in the Whitmore estate, Chase watched the live stream with a stunned expression. His champagne flute trembled in his hand. Ellis Whitmore sat beside him, unmoved. But the unspoken fear was beginning to bloom behind his eyes. For the first time, Chase realized he hadn't just insulted a woman. He had awakened a reckoning, and it had already begun. Less than an hour after Daria Monroe stepped away from the podium, her declaration had already exploded across every media platform. The headlines came fast and loud. CEO walks away from $900 million deal over public humiliation, calls out corporate complicity. Daria Monroe's refusal to bow shakes Silicon Valley. Monroe Innovations CEO draws line in the sand, dignity over dollars. Within 2 hours, clips of her speech had garnered over 12 million views on social media. By late afternoon, the number had doubled. Her final words, if that's the cost of doing business, I'm not buying, were being quoted everywhere, from finance blogs to feminist advocacy pages. Even late-night hosts ran it as their opening segment. And behind all of it, Daria sat quietly in her corner office, the storm outside pressing against the glass, but never once touching her composure. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She knew the real test was still ahead. Her inbox overflowed. Some emails came from industry peers, others from complete strangers. Many shared stories of being demeaned, dismissed, degraded, until someone finally stood up. That someone now was Daria. Sarah Kim burst into her office holding a tablet. Her cheeks were flushed, her voice breathless. Daria, she said, it's happening. Global reach. Look, every platform, every demo. We're trending in Japan, the UK, Nigeria, Brazil, everywhere. Daria took the tablet and looked over the charts. Line after line of soaring graphs, public sentiment, positive brand associations, even a spike in young female applicants overnight. We've had over 20 companies reach out with partnership proposals just this morning, Sarah added, including Sterling Global, Northpoint, Arganis Technologies, even Wilcox. Daria, that's huge. Daria nodded, absorbing the weight of it all. She handed the tablet back. I'm not signing anything until we vet every single one, she said. If they only want us because we're trending, we're not interested. Sarah smiled. You're a hard sell, you know that? No, Daria replied. I just learned the hard way that not all deals are worth it. Across town, the Whitmore estate was under lockdown, not physically, but internally. Phones rang off the hook. Crisis PR teams gathered in the West Wing. Ellis Whitmore stood in his study, stone-faced as a live feed of Daria's press conference played again on a muted screen. And Chase? Chase was pacing his father's office like a caged animal. She really did it, he muttered. She went through with it. Do you know what this is going to do to our name? Ellis didn't answer. Dad, Chase snapped. Say something. Ellis turned slowly. What do you want me to say? He asked coldly. That I'm proud? That you've dragged this family's name into one of the worst corporate scandals of the decade. Chase bristled. I didn't mean. You never do. Ellis interrupted. That's the problem. Outside the windows, nothing had changed. But inside, the Whitmore empire was beginning to fracture. By late evening, A 2-minute video began circulating online, taken from inside the ballroom the night Daria walked out. It had been filmed discreetly by someone in service uniform, likely a waiter. The quality was grainy, but the audio was clear. Did someone bring the help in early? Chase's voice said, laced with smugness. Nervous laughter. Silence. Then, Daria's walk of dignity. Her silence. Her exit. The video detonated across social media. Within minutes, hashtags like #RespectIsPriceless and #StandWithDaria began trending globally. People were furious, not just at Chase's words, but at the way no one had spoken up. The collective silence of that ballroom became symbolic of a much larger disease, complicity. In under 12 hours, public pressure was unbearable. Corporate partners began releasing statements. One by one, companies distanced themselves from Whitmore Holdings. Endorsements vanished. Ad spots were canceled. And then the stock price began to fall, fast. Ellis Whitmore, once the iron hand of high finance, watched as decades of calculated dominance crumbled in hours. The press now questioned not just Chase, but the family legacy itself. How long has this culture persisted within Whitmore Holdings? Is silence from the patriarch complicity or cowardice? Should Chase Whitmore be removed from all executive positions? In a private emergency meeting, the Whitmore board convened. We have to act, Thomas Gallagher, longtime partner and board chairman, said firmly. There's no spin that can fix this. Chase needs to step down. Immediately, Chase's face flushed with disbelief. You're firing me? From my own family's company. This company is bleeding, Gallagher said. And you're the wound. Back at Monroe Innovations, Daria stayed long past midnight. She sat at her desk, alone, a single desk lamp casting a halo across her paperwork. She had proposals from companies she'd once dreamt of partnering with, and now they were at her doorstep. But she didn't rush. She read each one, not just for numbers, but for values, for alignment, for long-term integrity. Sarah knocked once and stepped in quietly. You're still here, she said. I couldn't leave yet. Sarah hesitated, then said, I know you probably don't want to hear this right now, but, Daria, you did it. You changed everything. Daria looked up. Did I? You showed the world that you don't have to compromise to lead. That dignity matters. That we don't need to accept crumbs from men who see us as less. Daria didn't cry, but her jaw tightened. Her voice was softer when she spoke. If even one person saw what happened and felt less alone because of it, she whispered, then it was worth it. Sarah nodded, then reached into her bag and handed Daria a thick manila envelope. What's this? Daria asked. Invitation, Sarah said. Global Leadership Summit. They want you to speak. Keynote. Theme this year? The cost of dignity. Daria looked at the envelope, then back at the city lights flickering outside her office windows. She smiled, finally. Not a triumphant smile, but the quiet, knowing smile of someone who walked through fire and didn't burn. By dawn, what had begun as a controlled corporate dispute had erupted into a full-blown crisis of public trust. The Whitmore name, once spoken in boardrooms with reverence and fear, now echoed through headlines for all the wrong reasons. The video of Chase Whitmore's smug insult, "Did someone bring the help in early?" had crossed 100 million views globally. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was evidence. Clear, cruel, and unforgivable. The clip was dissected in newsrooms, classrooms, talk shows, and comment sections around the world. Major influencers, celebrities, and even politicians weighed in. This isn't just one man's mistake. It's a culture unchecked for generations. Cynthia Reeves, activist and media commentator. When you see a woman like Daria Monroe humiliated and still hold her ground, you realize that real power doesn't need noise. It just needs courage. Jackson Liu, best-selling author. The fallout was immediate and punishing. By 9 a.m., Whitmore Holdings stock had plunged 18% within the first few hours of trading. Institutional investors dumped their shares, brokers scrambled to minimize damage, and analysts predicted further collapse. The very foundation of the Whitmore empire, built over 70 years, was teetering. Inside the Whitmore Tower in downtown Manhattan, chaos ruled. Phone lines blared. Legal teams huddled. The crisis communications staff looked like they hadn't slept. Ellis Whitmore stood motionless in the war room, staring at the red numbers scrolling across monitors. Across from him sat his son, Chase, slumped in a leather chair, his face pale. The arrogance that once lit his expression had been replaced by something unrecognizable: fear. "Michael," Ellis began, voice thin with exhaustion. Chase looked up sharply. "It's Chase. I don't care what name you go by anymore," Ellis snapped. "What I care about is the fact that you've put everything we've built at risk with one thoughtless comment." "It was a joke," Chase muttered, defensively. "She took it too far." "No," Ellis said coldly. "You did." At 11 a.m., the board gathered for an emergency meeting. The tension in the air was unbearable. Most directors couldn't meet each other's eyes. Some had already drafted resignation letters, quietly preparing for the ship to sink. Thomas Gallagher, the chairman, stood at the head of the table. "We have no choice," he said. "To preserve what little credibility we still have, we must suspend Chase from all leadership duties, effective immediately. A full independent investigation will follow." "This is my family's company," Chase shouted, standing. "You can't vote me out." Thomas met his glare evenly. "You may carry the Whitmore name, Chase, but you no longer carry its respect." The vote passed. Unanimously, Chase stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard it echoed like a gunshot through the hallway. His legacy, once untouchable, had shattered in real time. Outside the building, protesters lined the sidewalk. Some held signs with bold letters. "Dignity isn't negotiable. We stand with Daria. Respect over riches." TV crews captured the chants that had grown into a movement. Live images streamed across CNN, NBC, and social platforms. Major companies began announcing they were severing ties with Whitmore Holdings. Marketing contracts canceled. Endorsements dropped. Sponsorships pulled. What began as one man's insult had now sparked a full-blown corporate reckoning. Across the city, in her office at Monroe Innovations, Daria Monroe stood at the window watching the city wake up. She hadn't spoken to the press since her conference, despite hundreds of requests. She didn't need to. Her silence, like her presence, carried weight. Sarah Kim entered quietly, holding a tablet and a small smile. "More updates," she said, handing it over. "The clip's at 160 million views now. We've had to expand the press team just to manage interview requests. And you've been named one of Forbes' most influential leaders of the year." Daria didn't react. She scrolled through the data, metrics, mentions, offers from Fortune 500 companies wanting to partner. "I didn't want it this way," Daria murmured. Sarah nodded. "I know, but you earned it. And you didn't ask for it. You demanded better. That's why people are behind you." Daria looked up. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's a mirror." "Then let's make sure they keep looking," Sarah replied. By late afternoon, the damage to the Whitmore empire was beyond PR repair. Clients fled. Their flagship partner in Europe pulled out. Even their real estate holdings took a hit as tenants expressed outrage online. In the Whitmore mansion, Chase stood alone in his office. For once, it was quiet. No assistants. No board. No father. No legacy. He stared at a muted television, watching Daria Monroe being honored in a panel discussion. Her face was calm. Her message uncompromising. She hadn't shouted, hadn't insulted, but she had destroyed everything he believed untouchable. His father entered, slower than usual. Age had finally caught up with Ellis. "Michael," he said. Chase didn't correct him this time. Ellis stared at his son with disappointment worn heavy in his eyes. "I always thought I was protecting you by shielding you from consequences," Ellis said. "But I failed you. I should have taught you that arrogance isn't power. That real influence is rooted in respect, not entitlement." Chase looked at him, hollow. "Is it too late?" Ellis sighed. "Not to rebuild. But what you destroyed, that'll take a lifetime to earn back." And then, just before leaving the room, Ellis added quietly, "She did what you never could. She stood for something that mattered." Back at Monroe Innovations, Daria's office buzzed with activity. But she remained as steady as ever. She signed 3 new partnership agreements, each one with companies that shared her values, each worth tens of millions. And still, she spoke little. No interviews. No social media posts. Just action. Her example had become a blueprint. Universities began teaching her case in business ethics. Students wrote essays about her. Activists marched with her quotes on placards. Young women of color found a new hero, not because she sought it, but because she embodied something timeless: the refusal to sell dignity at any price. A week after the video surfaced, the world had changed, at least in the orbit where Daria Monroe moved. But while headlines screamed her name and social media burned with hashtags like #StandWithDaria and #DignityIsPower, she remained, as always, grounded. She hadn't given a single interview. She hadn't posted a celebratory message. She hadn't uttered a word of self-congratulation. Instead, she worked. At the top floor of Monroe Innovations, her office had become a revolving door of opportunity. But Daria reviewed every partnership proposal herself, not for clout or headlines, but for values. She rejected more than she accepted. In her view, the goal wasn't to capitalize on a moment. It was to build something that would last far beyond it. Sarah Kim entered one morning carrying a thick stack of folders. She placed them on Daria's desk with a beaming expression. "This is it," she said. "We've finalized partnerships with 6 of the most reputable firms in the industry. Sterling Global, Northstar, Wilcox Group. All vetted. All clean." Daria looked over the papers. She didn't smile wide. She didn't lean back with triumph. Instead, she gave a small, thoughtful nod. "These deals aren't just about numbers," she said. "They're about making sure our integrity isn't a marketing tactic. It's our foundation." Sarah sat across from her. "Daria, you know you've changed everything, right? I mean, companies are rewriting their ethics policies. HR departments are quoting you. Young black women are walking taller." Daria gazed out the window, watching the early morning fog burn off over the bay. "I didn't set out to change anything," she said. "I just refused to shrink." "That's what makes it matter," Sarah whispered. Meanwhile, in the media and public consciousness, Daria had become more than a CEO. She was a symbol. Her photo appeared on magazine covers. Her quote, "My dignity is not for sale at any price," was printed on T-shirts, posters, and protest signs around the world. University students invoked her story in debates. Advocacy groups praised her as proof that quiet power could dismantle arrogant institutions. Editorials in the New York Times and The Guardian hailed her as a generational voice, not for defiance, but for integrity. Yet she never leaned into the fame. While others projected her onto global stages, Daria remained focused on work, steady, humble, and exacting. In painful contrast, the Whitmore family was falling deeper into chaos. Michael Whitmore, once a fixture of Forbes and Fortune features, was now the face of corporate disgrace. He avoided public spaces. His speaking engagements were canceled. Major publications retracted glowing profiles once written about him. Inside his sprawling estate, he wandered like a ghost. Rooms that once hosted lavish fundraisers and black-tie dinners now echoed with silence. And worse, regret. One night, as a news segment aired footage of Daria speaking at an ethics summit, Michael stood motionless in front of the screen. She wore a white suit, her hair pulled back. Her words were calm but cut deep. True leadership isn't about how loud you can speak. It's about how clearly your actions echo when the world is watching. Michael's jaw tightened. Every sentence felt like a blade, forcing him to look at a truth he never prepared for. He turned off the television, but the silence was louder than any words. Back at Monroe Innovations, Daria reviewed the final pages of the new partnership agreements. Collectively, the deals were worth well over $1 billion, surpassing what the Whitmore merger had promised. But it wasn't just the numbers that mattered. It was who they came from. Companies that didn't flinch when she chose principle. Companies that had watched her walk away from old money and seen strength, not threat. As Sarah handed her the final signature page, Daria paused. "You sure you want to sign it now?" Sarah asked. Daria smiled faintly. "I don't need a celebration. Just a clean page to begin again." She signed. With one stroke, a new chapter began. That evening, an invitation arrived. The Global Leadership Summit, one of the most prestigious gatherings of world leaders, entrepreneurs, and changemakers, had selected Daria Monroe as the keynote speaker. The theme, the cost of dignity. She accepted. A week later, Daria stood center stage beneath soft, white lighting. Thousands of attendees watched from every angle of the vast auditorium, and millions more tuned in live from around the world. She stepped to the podium in silence. No hype, no introduction, just presence. She began. Dignity isn't a luxury reserved for those who can afford it. It's a birthright. But too often, we're told we have to trade it for power, for approval, for a seat at the table. I was offered $900 million to look the other way. I said no. Not because I wanted to be brave, but because I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I said yes. The room fell still. She continued, "Some people told me I overreacted, that I should have let the moment pass. But I've learned, moments matter. The silence in a room can speak louder than the insult. And walking away doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, it's the strongest move you can make." As she paused, the audience sat utterly still. Not a cough, not a whisper, just attention. Then she finished, "We don't get to choose how others see us, but we do get to choose how we respond. My choice was dignity, and I hope it inspires someone else to do the same." The standing ovation was instant. Long, loud, unstoppable. Elsewhere, Michael Whitmore sat alone in his darkened office watching the speech on his laptop. His fingers clenched around a crystal glass, untouched. He didn't rage. He didn't scoff. He just watched, quietly, fully aware that the woman he mocked had become everything he once believed he already was. And that realization burned more than any headline. Backstage at the summit, Daria quietly packed her notes into a slim leather folder. An assistant approached her. "Miss Monroe, that was the most powerful thing I've ever heard. You've changed how I see myself." Daria smiled gently. Then it was worth it. She walked out of the building with no cameras, no entourage, just a quiet resolve that whatever came next, she would face it the same way she faced everything. With clarity, with truth, with unshakable dignity. The moment Daria Monroe stepped off the stage at the Global Leadership Summit, the applause still thundered behind her. But what she didn't realize was that her words were already echoing far beyond the auditorium. In a matter of hours, her keynote speech had been rebroadcast across every major news network. Her face, composed, calm, luminous in a simple white suit, filled TV screens, social feeds, and magazine covers worldwide. Her voice, measured and unwavering, had cut through the noise of politics, business, and division, landing like a rallying cry for millions. Her message was not one of revenge. It was not a declaration of war. It was a reminder that dignity, once compromised, is never truly restored with money. That walking away is sometimes the most powerful move you can make. That silence, when laced with self-respect, can shatter empires. Within days, social media erupted. Hashtags like #DignityAboveAll, #RespectIsPriceless, and #WeAreDaria surged to the top across countries, languages, and industries. College students cited her speech in business ethics essays. Protesters printed her quote, "My dignity is not for sale at any price," on posters carried through streets in New York, Nairobi, Mumbai, and Sao Paulo. Young professionals rewatched the video, not just for inspiration, but for courage. Courage to quit toxic jobs, to speak up in meetings, to remember their worth. Daria had become more than a CEO. She had become a symbol. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Michael Whitmore's world was unraveling in painful silence. He no longer appeared on magazine covers. The once courted heir to the Whitmore empire now lived in the shadows of canceled appearances, severed partnerships, and disgraced headlines. Corporate affiliates publicly distanced themselves. Brand partners terminated long-term contracts. PR firms refused to represent him. What he once built with arrogance and inherited wealth was collapsing, brick by silent brick. Inside the once proud Whitmore estate, Michael wandered from room to room like a ghost in his own legacy. The halls where galas had once been held were now dim. His name, once wielded like a golden key, now closed doors. One afternoon, he sat in the dark-paneled study, watching Daria's speech replay on his laptop. The screen lit her face with a soft glow. Her voice was calm, her poise unbearable. Every word she spoke felt like a judgment not from her, but from a world finally awake. "True success," she said, "isn't about the number on a contract. It's about the moment you decide what you're no longer willing to sacrifice." Michael's glass of bourbon remained untouched. He didn't turn the video off. He couldn't. Moments later, his father, Ellis Whitmore, entered the room. The man who had once built an empire now looked years older. He said nothing for a long time. Finally, with a voice tinged with sadness, he said, "Michael, I thought money would shield you. I thought legacy would protect you. But I was wrong. It only delayed the fall." Michael turned to face him. His voice was dry. "Is it too late?" Ellis sighed. "It's never too late to rebuild. But the world you broke won't wait for your apology." Elsewhere, at Monroe Innovations, Daria sat at her desk with the city skyline stretching beyond her office windows. The final partnership contracts had been signed. Collectively, they exceeded the value of the Whitmore deal by a wide margin. But that wasn't what made her proud. What mattered was who they were signed with. Companies with integrity, companies that shared her values, companies that hadn't needed a viral scandal to respect her worth. Her phone buzzed softly with a message from Sarah Kim. "You haven't just won, Daria. You've changed how the world defines power." Daria smiled faintly, her expression not triumphant, but peaceful. She thought of her younger self, sleeping in her car during her first failed startup, holding her breath during investor meetings where men explained her own technology back to her. She thought of being told she was too intense, too polished, too ambitious. All of it had led here. She had not shouted. She had not retaliated. She had simply said no, and the world had listened. 1 year later, Daria Monroe was named one of the most influential voices in global business, not for her wealth, but for her character. Not for her profit, but for her principles. Schools taught her story. Organizations honored her leadership, not because she played the game better, but because she changed the rules. And the Whitmores? After months of damage control, resignations, and lawsuits, the family name remained stained. The empire still functioned, but without its sheen. It had become a case study, not a symbol. A warning, not an aspiration. Michael Whitmore now lived a quiet, isolated life. Occasionally, he donated anonymously to charities supporting minority entrepreneurs. Occasionally, he wrote op-eds under a pseudonym. But whatever redemption he sought, he understood, it would not come quickly, nor fully. He had not just lost the deal. He had lost the world's respect. And that was a currency he would never hold again. Daria, however, continued to lead, not with noise, not with fame, but with clarity. She turned down multiple offers for a memoir. She refused to let her name be licensed for a television series. When asked why, she answered simply, "This isn't a story. It's a reminder." And it was. That dignity is not a trend. That silence, when chosen with strength, speaks louder than outrage. That the highest form of power is not dominance, but self-respect. So when people speak of Daria Monroe now, they don't talk about the scandal or even the summit. They talk about the moment she stood alone, and the world finally stood with her. Daria Monroe didn't just walk away from a deal. She walked into history. And with every quiet, steady step, she reminded us that dignity is worth more than any number. Because in a world obsessed with status, wealth, and applause, sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stand up, say nothing, and refuse to sell who you are. So here's the real question. What would you do if everything depended on staying silent, but your soul demanded you speak? If this story struck a chord with you, don't scroll away. Like this video if you believe dignity should never be traded. Comment below. Have you ever had to walk away from something because it compromised your values? Subscribe so you never miss stories that challenge power and speak truth, no matter how loud the world gets. Thank you for watching. And remember, the strongest people don't always roar. Sometimes, they just walk out of the room with their head held high.